Marybeth Rowe was born on September 11, 1942 in Duanesburg, New York, a small rural township roughly 10 miles south of Schenectady. Her parents were Ruth and Alton Rowe. Her father, Alton, worked as a press operator at a local General Electric facility, earning a modest wage. Her mother, Ruth, also worked, which meant that during significant stretches of Marybeth's early childhood, neither parent was reliably present. During World War II, Alton was deployed overseas entirely, leaving Ruth to hold the household together financially, while Marybeth, still in her formative years, was regularly passed between relatives for extended periods. Marybeth had one younger brother. At first, that fact seems unremarkable, but within the Rowe household, the dynamic between the two siblings carried significant weight. An elderly family relative told Marybeth directly and bluntly that she was an accident, a child who had not been wanted in the way her brother had been. Marybeth absorbed this and carried it with her for years. She eventually told her brother, "You were the one they wanted, not me." The nature of her relationship with her father is one of the most contested details in the case record. Marybeth herself gave several accounts, one time stating that Alton regularly beat her and locked her in a closet. On another occasion, she said, "My father hit me with a fly swatter because he had arthritis and his hands were not of much use. And when he locked me in my room, I guess he thought I deserved it." It should be stated that this alleged abuse has never been confirmed, and Marybeth herself is known to provide inconsistent stories. Regardless if the claims are true or not, it was clear that she greatly desired affection from her father, but was instead met with deep feelings of being unwanted. Alton died of a heart attack in October 1971, just 2 months before the birth of Marybeth's first child, Jennifer. She also made multiple attempts on her own life during her childhood and adolescence. The topic is of course very sensitive, but psychologists and investigators suspected that these early attempts actually taught Marybeth that extreme expressions of distress were the only way for her to generate responses from people in her life. Nobody seemed to care about her when she was suffering quietly. This lesson would prove catastrophic, as we'll soon discuss. She graduated from Duanesburg High School in 1961 and wanted to attend college but did not have the academic record to do so. This was another door that closed on her, serving as another instance of inadequacy. In the years that followed, she cycled through a series of jobs, including a waitress, school bus driver, nursing assistant, and more. None of these jobs offered social prestige or the kind of recognition that Marybeth sought. The position that proved most consequential was her work as a nursing assistant at Ellis Hospital. In the hospital environment, she encountered for the first time in her adult life a world organized around attentiveness to suffering. Patients in distress commanded the focused concern of skilled professionals. Caregivers were valued, appreciated, and recognized. For someone whose entire history had been defined by the experience of need going unmet, that environment registered on a deep level. Ellis Hospital would go on to become one of the central recurring locations in the most disturbing chapter of her life. In 1963, at the age of 20, she met Joe Tinning on a blind date arranged through mutual friends. Joe was shy and reserved, a man described uniformly by those who knew him as having a kindly disposition, someone who kept out of trouble, spoke quietly, and took life in stride. He worked for General Electric, the same company where Marybeth's own father worked. In Joe, Marybeth found something she had never reliably had, someone who paid attention to her. The fact that he was gentle where her father had been harsh and present where her father had been absent began to fill her void and add emotional stability to her life. 2 years after they met in the spring of 1965, they married and settled in Schenectady. Their life, viewed from outside, seemed like any other standard family. What went on inside that marriage, away from prying eyes, was considerably more complex. The most important detail to understand about Joe is that he was, by most accounts, emotionally unavailable. While I said that he came across as shy and introverted, others described him more as cold and indifferent. It was clear that he loved his children, but where he was lacking was having the emotional capacity to nurture his wife's chronic demanding need for affirmation in perpetuity. Marybeth found herself in a marriage that did not deliver what she had hoped it would. Their first child, Barbara, was born on May 31st, 1967, and their second, Joseph Jr., arrived on January 10th, 1970. In October 1971, Marybeth's father, Alton, died of a heart attack. Despite the alleged neglect and mistreatment Marybeth received from Alton, his death hit her hard. 2 months later, in December 1971, Marybeth gave birth to Jennifer, the couple's third child, at St. Clair's Hospital. Jennifer had hemorrhagic meningitis and multiple brain abscesses that had developed in utero, conditions so severe that she never left the hospital. She died 8 days after birth on January 3rd, 1972. What happened next in the weeks following Jennifer's death is where we first see a major shift in Marybeth's psyche. When Jennifer died, the community of Schenectady sympathized with Marybeth. They brought food, expressed condolences, attended the funeral, and surrounded Marybeth with a flood of focused, sustained attention. For most people, this kind of gesture is for sure meaningful, but it's something that fades as time passes and people move on with their lives. For Marybeth, it was something else entirely. It was the single largest concentrated dose of attention she had ever received in her life. People looked at her and cared about what happened to her. Her twisted interpretation of the situation was that the death of a child was a cost she was willing to pay for attention. From January 1972 to December 1985, every single child born into or adopted by the Tinning household died before reaching the age of 5. 9 children across 13 years. Not one survived. Viewed individually, each death carried a plausible if unfortunate medical explanation. This called into question whether the initial death involving Jennifer was planned by Marybeth herself. However, officials are all in agreement that Jennifer's death was 100% natural with no outside influence. The second death was Joseph Jr. He was 2 years old and physically healthy when he died. 3 weeks after Jennifer's death, Marybeth rushed him to the emergency room at Ellis Hospital, telling staff that he had experienced a seizure and had choked on his own vomit. Doctors examined him, but found nothing wrong. He was admitted and kept under observation for several days. When no underlying illness presented itself, the hospital discharged him. Within hours of arriving home, Marybeth brought him back to the same emergency room. This time, he was not breathing and doctors could not revive him. Without performing an autopsy, the attending physicians attributed his death to cardiorespiratory arrest arising from a viral infection accompanied by a seizure disorder. No autopsy meant no tissue samples, no forensic analysis, no investigation. There was just a signed death certificate and a diagnosis that closed the case on paper before any independent examination could take place. In later questioning, Marybeth said she had put him down for a nap and, when she checked on him later, found him tangled in the sheets with blue-tinged skin. Blue discoloration in a deceased infant is a clinical indicator of oxygen deprivation due to asphyxia, not an infection or cardiac arrest. The community's response to Joseph Jr.'s death was, if anything, even more intense than what had followed Jennifer's. 2 Tinning children dead in 3 weeks caused a massive inflow of attention, further strengthening Marybeth's twisted thinking. Barbara was the oldest of the Tinning children at nearly 5 years old and was the third to die. 6 weeks after Joseph Jr. died, on March 1st, 1972, Marybeth took Barbara to Ellis Hospital, claiming she had gone into convulsions. The emergency staff examined the girl and, according to one account, wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Marybeth refused and took her home. Within hours, she returned with Barbara, this time unconscious and unresponsive. The hospital staff was unable to bring the child back to full consciousness. Barbara slipped into a coma and died the following day, on March 2nd. The cause of death listed on the certificate was Rey syndrome, a condition involving swelling of the brain and liver, historically associated with viral illness and aspirin use in children. This third death in just a few months alarmed many folks, leading some to call the police directly. This was the first formal communication between medical officials and law enforcement on the subject of the Tinning family, but it amounted to nothing. Without a finding of homicidal or suspicious death from an official medical examiner, detectives had no opening to pursue a criminal investigation. Barbara's death was followed by a gap of a year and a half. On Thanksgiving Day, November 21st, 1973, at Ellis Hospital, Marybeth's fourth child, Timothy, was born. On December 10th of the same year, Marybeth told doctors she had found Timothy lifeless in his crib. He was brought to the hospital already dead. Physicians could identify no cause of death in line with a medical diagnosis. Without a specific cause to assign, the pathologist recorded the death as sudden infant death syndrome. To be clear, this is not an actual cause of death in the normal sense of the word. Rather, it's simply assigned when there is not enough evidence to point to any one specific cause. Prior to Timothy's birth, there was a haunting detail that one of Marybeth's co-workers shared with investigators later down the line. During the pregnancy, she told this co-worker that she was pregnant again and to make sure not to tell anyone about it. Then she added, God had told her to kill this one too. Fast forward to 1975, on March 30th, Marybeth gave birth to her fifth child, Nathan. On September 2nd that same year, she rushed Nathan to the hospital and told doctors that she had noticed him not breathing while she was driving. She stated she had been out in the car with the infant and observed him stop breathing during the trip. This death was attributed to acute pulmonary edema, a condition involving fluid accumulation in the lungs. Hospital personnel were by this point growing visibly more suspicious. Within the local community, awareness of the Tinning family was spreading, yet the death certificates continued to be signed with natural or undetermined causes. And without those certificates reflecting criminally suspicious findings, law enforcement continued to have no legal basis for action. In August 1978, the Tinnings adopted a newborn named Michael. 2 months later, on October 29th, Marybeth gave birth to their seventh child, Mary Frances. On January 20th, 1979, Marybeth rushed Mary Frances, then approximately 12 weeks old, to the hospital directly across the street from their apartment, claiming the infant was unconscious. Staff revived her, and once she was stabilized, she was sent home. Exactly 1 month later, Marybeth returned to the same hospital with the same child, this time in full cardiac arrest. Staff again succeeded in resuscitating the baby, but the oxygen deprivation during this second episode had caused irreversible brain damage, leaving Mary Frances on life support. 2 days later, Marybeth agreed to remove her from life support, leading to her death. The cause on record was cardiac arrest following brain damage without any finding of criminal causation. 4 months after Mary Frances died, Marybeth gave birth to Jonathan on November 19th, 1979. He was the couple's eighth child and the seventh to die. Unlike the other children, Jonathan's eventual death came after a drawn-out period of monitoring. According to records, Marybeth rushed him to the hospital because he was unconscious. Emergency physicians and specialists could not identify a cause for his condition. He was transferred to a facility in Albany, where he was placed on life support, and he remained there for 4 weeks before dying on March 24th, 1980. The official cause listed was cardiopulmonary arrest. Jonathan's death was particularly noteworthy because it was drawn out and monitored by specialists, yet still resulted in an unassuming death certificate. The adopted child, Michael, holds a unique and important position in the Tinning case. He was not Marybeth and Joe's biological child, so his death put an end to the death gene theory that had been floating around up to that point. In February 1981, Marybeth reported that Michael, then approximately 2.5 years old, had fallen down the stairs and suffered a concussion. She took him to the doctor and recovered. Then, about a month later, she took him to the doctor's office again because he would not wake up. By the time he arrived, he was already dead. The official cause of death was listed as bronchial pneumonia. Again, nothing was done. 4 years later, on August 22nd, 1985, at the age of 42, Marybeth gave birth to her ninth child, Tammy Lynn. 4 months later, in December, Marybeth called her neighbor, who was a nurse's aide, and said simply, "Get over here now." The neighbor arrived to find 4-month-old Tammy Lynn lying on a changing table, purple and not breathing. Marybeth told her neighbor and later told responding personnel that the baby had been fussy all evening. She said that when she could no longer tolerate the crying, she got up from watching television to check on Tammy Lynn, found her tangled in her blankets, and could not revive her. Unable to restore the child's breathing, she woke Joe, called her neighbor, and then called for an ambulance. Emergency personnel arrived shortly after the neighbor. Tammy Lynn was transported to St. Clair's Hospital where she was pronounced dead. The forensic pathologist who conducted Tammy Lynn's autopsy was aware of the Tinning family history. The baby's body showed purple discoloration of the skin, the same coloration that had been noted but not acted upon in earlier Tinning deaths. Despite this, and despite knowing the family background, the pathologist initially classified the death as sudden infant death syndrome like in the past. Hospital staff disagreed sharply. They contacted law enforcement stating their belief that marybeth had killed the child. On the same day of Tammy Lynn's death, a police detective arrived at the Tinning home. When he entered, marybeth greeted him and said, "I know what you're here for. You're going to arrest me and take me to jail." The detective did not arrest her that day, but the investigation had formally begun. In the weeks following, detectives from the Schenectady Police Department and investigators from the New York State Police met in Albany together to review all of the prior Tinning autopsy reports, hospital records, and other statements made by medical personnel over the course of the previous 14 years. What they saw confirmed what many officers had suspected for years, but the problem was never a lack of suspicion, rather just evidence. And the conclusion those groups came to at the end of that meeting remained the same. Criminal prosecution was still not viable with what they had. Throughout every death, every hospital visit, every police inquiry, Joe had remained steadfastly loyal to marybeth, and that was not about to change. This led officials to exhume the bodies of the prior victims in hopes of finding some piece of forensic data to help the case. But this was also a fruitless inquiry in the investigation. That left one path: an outright confession from marybeth Tinning herself stating that she killed her children. 7 weeks after Tammy Lynn's death, on February 4th, 1986, investigators made their move. A detective and a New York State Police investigator went to the Tinning home and asked marybeth to come with them to the state police station in Louderville for questioning. They were careful about how they framed the request. They made clear that she was not under arrest, that she was free to decline, and that this was voluntary questioning. Despite knowing why they were there, marybeth agreed to go. Before she left the house, she spoke briefly with Joe. According to marybeth's own later testimony, Joe told her not to call an attorney. At the state police station, marybeth was informed of her Miranda rights. She signed a document acknowledging that she understood and agreed to waive them and speak without an attorney present. At first, she denied everything. She told the investigators that she had done nothing to harm any of her children. The investigators told her plainly and directly that they did not believe her, that the evidence did not support her account, and that they had reviewed the history of her children's deaths in detail. The interrogation was not recorded, but multiple officers were present, and the accounts they gave were consistent with one another. At some point during the questioning, a state trooper who had known marybeth from childhood entered the room and joined the interrogation. This familiar presence appeared to have shifted the dynamic of the room. marybeth continued to resist, exclaiming that she didn't do anything. The investigators continued pressing, and then eventually she broke. She admitted to killing 3 of her children: Tammy Lynn, Timothy, and Nathan. She denied any involvement in the deaths of the other 5: Jennifer, Joseph Jr., Barbara, Mary Frances, Jonathan, and Michael. For each of the 3 she admitted to killing, she said she had used the same method: suffocating the victims with a pillow. In regard to Tammy Lynn, marybeth said, "I got up and went to her crib and tried to do something with her to get her to stop crying. I finally used the pillow from my bed and put it over her head. I held it until she stopped crying." After admitting to the crimes, detectives brought Joe Tinning into the interrogation room. marybeth repeated her confession to him in person. Joe showed no visible emotional reaction. marybeth was formally arrested on February 4th, 1986, and charged with the murder of Tammy Lynn. She posted $100,000 bail and was released from custody pending trial. A controversial decision in the case was the choice to only charge marybeth with Tammy Lynn's murder, but not any of the other children. This was a calculated judgment made after examining the full landscape of the evidence at hand. The other deaths, even those she had confessed to, presented serious forensic problems. Timothy and Nathan had both been confessed to, but when forensic pathologists attempted to examine the exhumed remains, the results were useless. 2 of the 3 exhumed bodies were too badly decomposed to yield any meaningful physical evidence, and the 3rd exhumation involved a body recovered from the wrong grave. Without forensic corroboration of the confessions for those 2 children, building a separate murder case around either death was extraordinarily difficult. Since Tammy Lynn's death was more recent, obtaining all the needed forensic data was much easier and presented the strongest possible foundation for a murder charge. On December 16, 1986, almost exactly 1 year after Tammy Lynn's death, the preliminary hearing was held. It was there that Marybeth, through her attorney Martin Cirancione, formally rescinded every word of her confession. Her position was that the 36-page confession that Marybeth herself had signed was a fabrication produced under duress. She said, "They were telling me what to say. The police made a statement and I just repeated it." Her attorney filed a formal motion to suppress the entire confession on the grounds that it had been obtained in violation of her Miranda rights, specifically arguing that her repeated requests for an attorney during the interrogation had been ignored, that she had been threatened by investigators, and that the confession had not been voluntarily given. The investigators who carried out the questioning were brought in and testified that Marybeth had been read her rights, signed an acknowledgement of understanding, and never requested an attorney. They added that she had not been handcuffed or physically harmed in any way. Furthermore, it was shared that Joe himself had told Marybeth not to call an attorney. Marybeth testified to the contrary on virtually every point. Ultimately, the motion to suppress was denied and the 36-page confession would be admitted at trial. The murder trial opened on June 22, 1987 before Judge Clifford T. Harrigan. Just before the trial opened, the county court conducted an additional hearing on the prosecution's request to introduce evidence of the confessed killings of Timothy and Nathan. The defense argued strenuously that allowing a jury to hear about other deaths would be unfairly prejudicial. The court initially ruled that a redacted version of the confession would be introduced. This redacted version contained a line where Marybeth was quoted saying, "Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy. I smothered each with a pillow because I'm not a good mother." That ruling changed during the trial itself. Because the defense chose to present medical evidence arguing that Tammy Lynn had died of natural causes, and specifically that the Tinning children may have been afflicted with a hereditary disease, the court determined that the defense had opened the door to the complete unredacted confession. By advancing a theory that the deaths were natural and possibly genetic, the defense made the full circumstances of the other deaths directly relevant to rebutting that theory. County court accordingly allowed the complete 36-page transcript into evidence. This was a significant blow to the defense. Jurors would now hear, in Marybeth's own words, her account of killing all 3 children she had confessed to. After 6 weeks of trial, the case went to the jury, 7 men and 5 women. They deliberated for 23 hours across 3 days. During deliberations, the jury made a request. They called for a readback of Joe Tinning's testimony. They wanted to hear again from the transcript what Joe had said about the conversation he and Marybeth had after the interrogation. Joe had testified that after the police questioning concluded, he and Marybeth were allowed to speak privately for approximately 5 minutes. During that conversation, he said that Marybeth told him plainly, "I killed Tammy." On July 17, 1987, they found Marybeth Tinning not guilty of intentional murder on the first count, but guilty of second-degree murder by depraved indifference to human life on the second count. The legal distinction is meaningful. Intentional murder required proof that she had deliberately set out to kill her daughter with premeditated intent. Depraved indifference murder required proof that she had recklessly engaged in conduct, creating a grave risk of death under circumstances that demonstrated a wanton disregard for human life. As the verdict was read, Marybeth placed both hands over her eyes and began crying quietly. Joe, when asked afterward for his reaction, said, "I still think she's innocent." The sentence imposed was 20 years to life, 5 years shorter than the maximum of 25 years to life available for a depraved indifference murder conviction. She was remanded to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. At her sentencing hearing, Marybeth read out a statement. It said, "I just want you to know that I played no part in the death of my daughter, Tammy Lynn. I did not commit this crime, but I will serve the time in prison to the best of my ability. However, I will never stop fighting to prove my innocence." Marybeth appealed her conviction in December 1988. Her attorney advanced 4 primary arguments: that the confession had been involuntarily obtained and should have been suppressed, that county court had blundered in allowing evidence of the uncharged killings of Timothy and Nathan, that the prosecutor's summation had been so prejudicial as to deprive her of a fair trial, and that the evidence was insufficient to support the verdict. This appeal was denied. An interesting discussion that opened up down the line was the potential that Marybeth had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now reclassified as DSM-5, factitious disorder imposed on another. The disorder describes a pattern in which a caregiver, most commonly a mother, fabricates, exaggerates, or physically induces illness or harm in a dependent, most often a young child, in order to generate sympathy and attention. The behavioral fit with Marybeth's pattern is striking. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael H. Stone, who examined the case, actually placed her at level 7 on his personal 22-point dangerousness scale, saying that Marybeth is highly narcissistic and attention-seeking. The ceiling at level 22 is reserved for psychopaths who commit prolonged torture and murder, often involving erotic behavior. This includes serial killers like Ted Bundy, Ed Gein, etc. It is worth noting, however, that it remains officially unclear whether Marybeth was ever formally diagnosed with DSM-5. The diagnosis was not formally introduced during her trial, and the legal record does not confirm a clinical finding. Another commonly discussed topic within this case is Joe Tinning himself. He was by Marybeth's side during the deaths of all 9 of his children. Throughout the decades of incarceration, Joe visited Marybeth regularly, never publicly wavering in his support of her. He really didn't seem to care that his children were being killed and was adamant that Marybeth was innocent. Whether Joe was complicit, willfully blind, or genuinely incapable of processing what was in front of him has never been legally determined. He was never charged with any crime. In the 1974 barbiturate poisoning incident, when Marybeth put pills into his drink and nearly killed him, he declined to pursue charges and quietly remained in the marriage. His sustained loyalty is among the more complex elements in an already twisted case. Marybeth's first parole hearing came in March 2007, 20 years into her sentence. She told the board she had no recollection of harming her daughter and could not believe she had done so. Parole was denied. Her second hearing in January 2009 produced a more direct statement. She said, "I was going through bad times when I killed my daughter. The board called her remorse superficial at best and denied release again." By her third hearing in January 2011, she offered what was arguably her most revealing public statement about the killings. She told the board, "After the deaths of my other children, I just lost it. I became a damaged, worthless piece of person, and when my daughter was young, in my state of mind at that time, I just believed that she was gonna die also. So I just did it." That statement, while not a full legal admission covering all 9 children, was the closest Marybeth ever came to articulating her psychology behind the killings. Regardless, she was denied parole at that hearing due to insufficient demonstrated remorse. At her 2013 hearing, she told the board, "I can't remember, I mean I know I did it, but I can't tell you why, there is no reason." The board responded by stating that her victim was an innocent, vulnerable child who had been entrusted to her as a mother, and that discretionary release would deprecate the severity of the crime. She was denied again in 2015 and in January 2017. At her 7th parole hearing in July 2018, Marybeth, then 75 years old, was finally granted parole. She was released from Taconic Correctional Facility on August 21st, 2018 after 31 years of incarceration. Joe was present at the facility for her release. As conditions of parole, she was required to remain under state supervision for the rest of her life, abide by a curfew, and attend domestic violence counseling. She returned to live in Schenectady County. The reaction among local officials and community members was largely one of outrage. New York State Senator Jim Tedisco stated publicly, "I don't think Marybeth Tinning should ever see the light of day." Herbert Richard Baumeister, often referred to simply as Herb, was born on April 7, 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana, as the eldest of 4 children in a comfortable middle-class family. His father, Dr. Herbert Eugene Baumeister, was an anesthesiologist, and his mother, Elizabeth, was a homemaker. The family was financially stable, church-going, and respectable. As a child, he was consistently in trouble at school, but not for typical children's shenanigans. Instead, his behavior deeply unsettled teachers and classmates. He was recalled as strange, off-putting, and fundamentally misaligned with social norms. One notable incident occurred around elementary or middle school when he placed a dead crow on a teacher's desk. Whether it was meant as a poor taste prank or something darker is unknown. He was also reported by friends who knew him during his youth to have been fascinated with urination. He often pondered what it would taste like. A Radford University case study on Herb noted that there were even rumors he urinated on a teacher's desk. By his teenage years, his father had grown alarmed and decided to act. Eugene secretly took his son to visit multiple mental health professionals. The result of those consultations, according to multiple accounts, was a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. It should be noted that this detail is not universally verified, but it surfaces in enough independent sources to be treated as plausible rather than purely speculative. What is definitively documented is what happened 6 months after Herb married his wife, Julie. His father had him committed to a psychiatric facility where he remained for nearly 2 months. Julie, who had been married to him for only half a year at that point, said she did not object. She said Herb was hurting and needed help. In 1965, he enrolled at Indiana University, dropped out after his first year, and eventually returned, which is where he met Julie, a fellow student and member of the Young Republicans Club. The two began dating and, despite the clear dysfunction already visible in Herb's life, married in November 1971. They would go on to have a son named Eric and 2 daughters named Marn and Emily. Julie would later reveal in interviews that she and Herb were intimate only 5 or 6 times across the entirety of their 25-year marriage. She always described him as a nurturing and sometimes distant father who helped his kids with homework, made their lunches, and was devoted to the family's stability. After leaving Indiana University, Herb bounced around from job to job. This period of his life revealed a lot regarding the tension between his seemingly functioning outward persona and his underlying instability. His longest held and most significant employment at the time was at the Indiana State Bureau of Motor Vehicles, where he worked from 1974 to 1985. During that time, he was productive enough to eventually be promoted to the rank of program director. But even there, the aberrant behavior never fully went away. Coworkers noted unprovoked outrages, extended disappearances during the workday, and urinating in inappropriate places, a behavior that would follow him through every job he held. On one occasion, he urinated on a letter addressed to the governor of Indiana. Eventually, Herb was fired from this job. Around that same time, he ran into legal trouble as well. In 1985, he was accused of committing a hit and run while driving under the influence of alcohol. In 1986, at almost 40 years old, he faced charges of auto theft and conspiracy to commit theft. Then, in 1988, Herb borrowed $4,000 from his mother and used it to open the first Save a Lot store location in Indianapolis. The stores initially sold secondhand goods, including clothing, furniture, and household items. Within a few years, the Baumeisters had opened a second location and were turning enough profit that they were able to purchase Fox Hollow Farm, an 18-acre estate in the Indianapolis suburb of Westfield, for approximately $1 million. The property featured a large Tudor-style home of roughly 11,000 square feet, a 5-car garage, stained glass windows, 2 libraries, and an indoor swimming pool in the basement. This gave Herb something he had never had before: private land, seclusion, and dense woods. Every summer, Julie would pack up the children and drive to Herb's mother's lake house, where she and Eric, Marn, and Emily would spend extended stretches of the season. Herb stayed home, stating that the demand of managing the Save-A-Lot stores was far too great for him to leave. This was never questioned, and his family trusted him. What they did not know was that when they were gone, Herb was making the roughly 40-minute drive south to Indianapolis and entering an entirely different world. He began showing up in the city's gay bars at some point in the early 1990s, operating under the false name of Brian Smart. The bars he frequented were concentrated on the north side of downtown Indianapolis. Herb maintained a pretty low profile whenever he visited. He would drink, socialize, and seek out gay white men. Herb would entice them with his large home, indoor pool, and more. Later reports stated that he brought anywhere from 1 to 2 dozen men back to his farmland. However, this number is sometimes speculated to be even higher when discussing another series of events that I'll go deeper into later on. These men that Herb brought home were not merely casual hookups. At some point in the night, he brought his guest to the pool, where he would discuss his fondness for asphyxiation. Herb would coerce his guest into playful strangulation with the pool's hose, but would then straight up strangle them to death. He then burned the bodies and crushed the bones to minimize volume and buried the fragmented remains across the wooded acres of the estate. He did this repeatedly, year after year, while his wife took the children to the lake. One of the more chilling details to emerge in the case involves the basement. Investigators who searched the property in 1996 noticed that the layout of the entertainment area near the indoor pool seemed staged. Retired Sheriff's Office Detective Kerry Milligan recalled that when he examined the space, he noticed a vent positioned directly above a chaise lounge, perfectly angled to conceal a recording device looking straight down. He asked Julie whether Herb had been a frequent videographer. She confirmed that he had and led Milligan to a storage room where his tapes would normally have been kept, a shelf that was conspicuously empty. Police would later note that a box of tapes was spotted in Baumeister's vehicle at some point, but what had become of them was unknown and they were never recovered. Mark Goodyear, a man who is believed to have had an encounter with Herb in 1994 and survived, stated that Herb forced him to watch some of those tapes. Goodyear said the footage was so disturbing that it made him scream. He declined to describe what he saw in specific terms, saying only that, quote, "The minute you got a flash of what was going on, it made you scream." There is also the unsettling inclusion of mannequins. When police searched Fox Hollow Farm, they found that Herb had arranged mannequins throughout the basement space near the pool. They were positioned as if they were attending a gathering, or perhaps as if they were sitting in the audience of something. While all of this was happening behind the walls of Fox Hollow Farm, the Indianapolis gay community was beginning to notice that something was wrong. The timeline of disappearances in retrospect is staggering. At least 8 men aged between 20 and 33 went missing after frequenting the bars in downtown Indianapolis from May 1983 to July 1994. Ted Fleischacker, then the publisher of a newspaper called The Word, became the most persistent voice sounding the alarm. Bar owners, many of whom also advertised in his paper, began pressuring him to investigate. They were frightened and didn't want their businesses to develop a reputation for being the places where men disappeared. The more he dug, the more clearly he saw what was happening. He published his concerns openly in his newspaper, and similar coverage appeared in another local publication, the New Works News, which even ran a first-person account from a man who had barely escaped an assailant. In retrospect, this account described someone other than Herb, but it was a remarkably similar encounter. But a major issue was that these publications circulated primarily within the gay community. They had no access to the mainstream news cycle or any leverage to spread awareness. Fortunately, even without the help of the mainstream, Herb's crimes would eventually be revealed, and at the center of it all was a man named Tony Harris. Now, to be clear, Tony Harris is just a pseudonym, and the individual's real name and face have never been made public. Harris first encountered Herb as Brian Smart at a bar around 1992. The encounter began very ordinarily. Herb invited the man back to a private estate, and the two had a normal conversation on the drive out. But what happened once they arrived at the property was anything but normal. After arriving, Herb proposed erotic asphyxiation, and Harris agreed. Like with previous victims, Herb retrieved the hose and began to choke Harris, but refused to stop. Harris realized that he might die, so he made a split-second decision to go completely limp and faked unconsciousness rather than fight back physically. Herb was totally fooled and released his grip, and this is where details get a little unclear. As mentioned, most if not all of Herb's victims that were brought back to Fox Hollow Farm were concealed somewhere on the property or nearby. However, it's actually believed that Herb may have killed even prior to obtaining that larger property, and in order to dispose of his victims' remains, he would drive to I-70 and dump them there. So, for whatever reason, Herb decided to drive Harris's body to an unspecified location. Either he dumped Harris somewhere, or Harris decided to escape the vehicle himself when deemed viable. Regardless of what actually occurred, Harris was able to eventually get to a police department to report his story. He told officials that a man named Brian Smart, who owned a large property, tried to murder him with a pool hose. He mentioned seeing a sort of sign plastered in front of what he believed was a farm located north of Indianapolis. He also told police that he believed Brian Smart was connected to the disappearance of his friend Roger Goodlett. His reasoning was that Smart had been unusually focused on a missing persons poster of Goodlett hanging in a bar earlier that evening. He kept returning to it, staring at it for long stretches of time. Despite all of this, investigators could not identify Brian Smart. Without a real name, an address, or corroborating physical evidence, the trail went cold. In the meantime, Herb continued to visit the bars. For 3 full years after Harris's initial report, Brian Smart remained a ghost. Then one day, Harris was sitting in the Varsity Lounge when Brian Smart walked in. It had been roughly 3 years since their encounter at the farm, and Harris recognized him immediately. He stayed composed and didn't confront Smart or call attention to himself. He watched his movements and followed him outside when he left. Smart got into his car, and Harris wrote down the license plate number to provide to authorities. The plate instantly revealed that it belonged to a vehicle registered to a man named Herbert Baumeister of Westfield, Indiana. Investigators went to Fox Hollow Farm in November 1995 and asked Herb and Julie for permission to search the property as part of their investigation. The couple refused. Without a warrant and without evidence sufficient to compel one, police were powerless to move further. Officials left and the case began to stall. Interestingly, more than a year before Harris's license plate tip led investigators to Herb's front door, a discovery had already been made at Fox Hollow Farm. Not by law enforcement, but by a 13-year-old boy. In the fall of 1994, Eric Baumeister was exploring the woods on the family's property when he found a human skull. He brought it to his mother and she asked her son to take her back to where he had found it. Eric led Julie to a dense undergrowth behind the home, and after further inspection, she found more. There was a pile of partially buried bones, enough to suggest an entire human skeleton. Julie confronted her husband and his response was disturbingly calm. He told her there was nothing to worry about. He reminded her that his father had been an anesthesiologist who had worked with anatomy during his medical training. The skeleton, Herb explained, was the remnant of a medical school anatomical display that had once belonged to his late father. He offered no elaboration on why a medical school skeleton had come to be partially buried in the woods. Julie accepted the explanation and didn't call the police. She didn't even question the situation any further, leading to speculation on whether or not she knew what was actually happening but was simply in denial. To call the police would have meant deciding in that moment that her husband of 23 years was a liar and potentially even a murderer. In the days following the confrontation, the skull disappeared. By the spring of 1996, Julie and Herb's marriage was collapsing. The family stores were nearing bankruptcy after a run of poor financial decisions and mismanagement. Herb was becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to be around, and the couple had begun divorce proceedings. Then, in June 1996, with Herb out of town, Julie made the decision that would finally bring everything to light. She called the police and told them they had her permission to search the property. Police arrived at the farm on June 24th, and what they found exceeded anything that even the most seasoned investigators could have anticipated. The search began in the woods behind the mansion and expanded outward. Almost immediately, investigators found human remains. As the search continued, more and more remains were found. This ordeal was originally expected to take no more than a single day, but stretched into 2 weeks. One official was quoted as saying, "It's like a bomb went off in a people factory," after seeing bones and bone fragments scattered across the property. In total, investigators unearthed more than 10,000 human bone fragments from the grounds of the property. The fragments ranged in size from small, thumbnail-sized chips to larger skeletal segments, and many of them had evidence of being deliberately set on fire. The combination of burning and crushing meant that identifying the victims was exceedingly more difficult. Nevertheless, investigators were able to make initial identifications from among the thousands of fragments. As of 2026, the identifications totaled approximately 10 confirmed identifications, and amongst them was Harris's friend Roger Goodlett, who went missing. Based on the volume of fragments found, officials estimate that there were at least 25 victims in total. One of the more disturbing pieces of evidence found in the woods was a set of handcuffs, still attached to a human arm. Nearby, police also recovered shotgun shells. County Coroner Jeff Jellison has said that the evidence points strongly toward the possibility that Herb did not act entirely alone. The sheer physical logistics of moving bodies through dense woodland repeatedly in the volumes the remains suggest would have been extraordinarily difficult for one person. He said, "I'm a coroner. I move deceased individuals daily. That's not an easy task. When you look at everything, I think it points very strongly towards a potential accomplice or at least a helper." This led to online speculation about the use of things such as a wheelbarrow. However, these woods were extremely thick, and lugging around a 100 to 200 pound body in a wheelbarrow hundreds of feet was a tall task. There has been no evidence suggesting that the burning or crushing of the remains was done indoors, which was a suggestion made early in the investigation. On the same day the search commenced, an arrest warrant was issued for Herb. However, before authorities even reached the property, Herb was already gone. He had left town, moving north. He crossed the border into Canada and entered Ontario. He then drove to Pinery Provincial Park, a stretch of forest and dunes about 3 hours southwest of Toronto. Fast forward to July 3rd, Herb's 49th birthday, a group of campers in Pinery Provincial Park discovered a body lying in the woods near the park's grounds. The man had been shot in the head. Nearby lay a Magnum revolver and a 3-page handwritten note, written on yellow notepaper. The man was Herb Baumeister, and he had taken his own life. The exact timeline of the days between the start of the farm search and Herb's death is not fully documented in public records, but a handful of details came up through various accounts. According to one source, police had at least one confirmed contact with Herb during his time on the run. His son had apparently been with him at some point during the escape, seemingly unaware of what was happening. When police tracked them down, officers took the boy and left Herb free for whatever reason. As for the note left behind, it was described as the lament of a man destroyed by external circumstances. This included his failed marriage, his collapsing business, and end of a life he spent decades building. In one particular passage, Herb reportedly expressed regret about making a mess in the park, as if the most pressing concern in his final act was the inconvenience his body might cause to other people at the park. He was, by multiple accounts, careful to position himself away from an area where children were playing, to spare them the shock of finding a corpse. What is particularly intriguing about the note is actually what it doesn't include. There was not a single word about the murders, no confession or explanation of what had been happening in the woods, no names for the victims, nothing. He wanted the note to portray him as a victim of misfortune instead of a murderer. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who has written extensively on serial killer psychology, and David Lester of Stockton University, who co-authored a study on serial killers that take their own lives, have both noted that roughly 17 to 23% of serial killers who reach a point of legal entrapment choose death over arrest and trial. The motivations are varied, but Lester has specifically suggested in reference to Herb that shame over his homosexuality may have been a central psychological driver. The self-loathing generated by being a closeted gay man in the context of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s contributed both to his murderous behavior toward openly gay men and to his inability to face public exposure as a killer. Because he died before a warrant for murder was formally executed, he cannot technically be called a convicted killer. Legally, he remains an alleged perpetrator. The evidence against him is considered overwhelming by virtually every investigator and criminologist who who has studied the case, but the cogs in the justice system that produces verdicts and convictions never reached him. Earlier in the video, I mentioned Herb potentially being tied into another string of cases. This was in reference of the I-70 Strangler. The suspicion is that Fox Hollow Farm may have only represented the final phase of a killing career that started over a decade earlier. I won't be going into extremely deep details on the Strangler cases, but it began with the discovery of a 15-year-old boy's body in rural Hamilton County, Indiana on June 16, 1980. His name was Michael Petrie. He was found naked, and the cause of death was established as strangulation, with no traces of drugs or alcohol in his system. Michael had been reported missing 9 days earlier and had subsequently been spotted in different parts of Indianapolis riding in a stranger's car. Despite his age, he had been working as an escort in the areas around Indianapolis's gay bars, which placed him near the area that Herb scouted his own victims. Over the next 11 years, at least 11 more bodies were found in consistent circumstances, leading investigators to conclude the work was done by a single serial killer. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 42 and were all found naked and were strangled to death. Their bodies were found in rural ditches, streams, gullies, and beside railroad tracks along the path of Interstate 70. What's believed to be the Strangler's final killing occurred in October 1991. This detail is key in the circumstantial case against Herb. The Baumeister family purchased Fox Hollow Farm in 1991. The timing is not merely coincidental in the eyes of investigators, it is the structural backbone of the theory that Herb committed both sets of murders. Before 1991, without private land, he had no choice but to transport his victims and dump them in rural areas. After 1991, he had 18 acres of dense private woodland where bodies could be disposed of however he liked. The roadside dumping simply stopped because it was no longer necessary. The identical victim profile is also striking. The FBI joined the investigation in 1983, with profilers working on a behavioral signature for the killer. Their conclusions determined that the killer of at least some of the victims was likely a white man of approximately 45 years of age, holding a high-paying job, well respected in his community, probably married, but without real intimacy with his wife. He likely felt shame and guilt about his attraction to males. Attractions that, profilers concluded, could destroy his career and reputation, generating the kind of hatred turned outward that manifested in murder. Herb Baumeister, at the time of the farm discovery, was 49, white, ran a relatively successful business, was respected in the Westfield community, was married but virtually celibate, and had been concealing a gay identity for his entire adult life. The profile was uncomfortably precise with Herb. The other major suspect in the I-70 Strangler case was Larry William Eiler, a convicted serial killer who was on death row in Illinois at the time of the Fox Hollow Farm discovery for the 1986 murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges. While there were some similarities between the cases, the differences in method were also pretty significant. Larry killed with a knife, while the Strangler obviously strangled his victims. Larry's killings also unfolded over a shorter period, while the Strangler operated for 11 years. In November 1990, while awaiting execution, Larry offered to provide information on more than 20 additional murders in exchange for a commuted sentence, a plea deal that ultimately fell apart when it reached Cook County, Illinois. After his death by lethal injection on March 7, 1994, his lawyer released a posthumous confession in which he admitted to 21 murders committed between 1982 and 1984, none of which were the Strangler's official victims. The I-70 Strangler case remains officially unsolved to this day. No charges were ever brought. No conviction was ever obtained, and I just came across this other detail regarding Herb after I finished recording this entry. To be clear, this is more of a theory than anything else, but I found it disturbing enough to where I still want to mention it. In 2025, there was a Hulu docuseries on Herb Baumeister, and it discussed concerns about the thrift stores. Both investigators and filmmakers have speculated that after killing his victims, Herb took their clothing and moved them through his thrift store locations to sell to the public. Director Alex Jablonski said, "We believe, and we heard this from some sources, that he was taking the clothing of the men that he killed and then depositing it at the thrift stores that he owned and then selling that clothing. It was like these guys just disappeared into thin air. Not even the clothes were left behind."